6 ancient carvings sit in museums, temples, and jungle ruins right now, and they look like things that weren't supposed to exist for another 1,000 years. Not vaguely, not if you squint. We're talking about shapes, proportions, and mechanical features that engineers today recognize immediately. A figure reclined at 45 degrees, hands-on controls, foot on a pedal, exhaust firing below. Gold figurines with swept-back delta wings. A stabilizing tail fin, and a fuselage. Tested in 1994 by aeronautical engineers and confirmed to generate lift. A relief carved into the underground crypt of an Egyptian temple showing an elongated bulb, a snake-shaped filament inside, connected by a cable to a box sitting in a room where, by the mainstream account, no lamp could have burned without leaving soot on the ceiling. And there is no soot. The official version says these are animals, mythology, coincidence, religious symbolism. But here's the thing about coincidence. At some point, it stops being coincidence and starts being a pattern. And a pattern demands an explanation. If you've been watching this channel for a while, welcome back. If this is your first time here, what you're about to hear is the kind of material that academia has spent decades explaining away. Stick around. The channel goes deeper every week, and the rabbit hole you're about to enter has no bottom. Hit that subscribe button now if you want to be here when the next one drops. Let's go. We're not starting with opinion, we're starting with numbers. The textbook timeline of human technology runs roughly like this. Sustained powered flight, 1903. The internal combustion engine, mid-1800s. Electric light, 1879. The rocket engine as a concept, early 20th century. Before that, according to every mainstream archaeology course on the planet, human beings had none of it. Horses, sails, fire, wheels. That's the story. Now, the Quimbaya civilization of what is now Colombia created a series of small gold figurines. Over 100 of them have been recovered. The Museo del Oro in Bogota, one of the most respected archaeological institutions in South America, has them on display today. Most of the figurines are clearly animals, birds, fish, insects, bats. You can see the eyes, the beaks, the curved organic shapes, but roughly a dozen of them are different. These particular pieces have a horizontal stabilizing tail fin positioned exactly where a modern aircraft's tail sits. They have swept-back delta wings, the same aerodynamic geometry used in supersonic jets. They have a clearly defined fuselage, no eyes, no beak, no organic curves. The wings attach at the bottom of the body, not the top, which is the opposite of every bird the Quimbaya ever carved. The Colombian government officially classifies them as zoomorphic, shaped like animals. But the same museum also displays the Quimbaya's actual animal carvings. Side by side, the difference is not subtle. These are not birds. Not any bird that has ever existed on this planet. In 1994, 3 researchers, including 2 aeronautical engineers, Peter Belting and Conrad Lubbers, built scale models of these figurines at 5 times their original size. They added an engine. They ran the tests, and the models flew. Controlled, stable flight. The aerodynamic proportions worked without modification to the wing geometry. The official response? The Quimbaya were inspired by insects or flying fish, possibly a now extinct creature. Here's the problem with that explanation. Flying fish don't have delta wings. Insects don't have horizontal tail stabilizers positioned on a separate rear fuselage. And no insect in the fossil record has ever had that wing-to-body ratio. What's more, the Quimbaya knew exactly how to carve insects. They did it hundreds of times. Those look nothing like these. Coincidence? Possibly. But a coincidence that passes an aerodynamic flight test is a very specific kind of coincidence. And that's just one. Now it gets really interesting. Deep in the jungles of Chiapas, Mexico, inside the Temple of the Inscriptions at the ancient Maya city of Palenque, a Mexican archaeologist named Alberto Ruiz Lujilier made one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century. In 1952, after 4 years of excavation, he broke through to a hidden burial chamber beneath the temple floor. Inside was the sarcophagus of King Kinich Janab Pakal, who ruled Palenque from 615 to 683 AD. The lid of that sarcophagus measures roughly 12 feet by 7 feet and is carved in extraordinary detail. It is one of the most studied pieces of stone in the world. Mainstream Mayan scholars say it depicts Pakal at the moment of death, falling into the underworld, surrounded by cosmological symbols representing rebirth, the world tree, the serpent, ancestral spirits emerging from the earth. That interpretation is detailed, internally consistent, and supported by the surrounding Mayan text carved into the sarcophagus itself. And yet, look at what the carving actually shows in purely visual terms, without the mythological framework. A human figure reclined at approximately 45 degrees, knees bent, what appears to be a breathing apparatus near the face, hands in a position that, to a modern engineer, looks like operating controls. One foot positioned on what looks like a pedal. Below the figure, a mechanism with what appears to be a combustion event, fire, and exhaust pointing downward. Erich von Däniken, in his 1968 book Chariots of the Gods, compared the pose directly to the posture of NASA Mercury astronauts during launch: reclined, restrained, operational. He was widely mocked for it. But here's what the mockers rarely mention. The visual resemblance to a rocket cutaway diagram is not vague. Aerospace engineers have looked at this carving and described the same features independently, not because they want it to be a rocket, because that's what the shape communicates to a trained eye. Does that prove ancient spaceflight? No, it does not. The Mayan textual record is real. It is extensive, and Mayan scholars who have spent their careers reading it say it tells a different story. But here's the uncomfortable question. How does a civilization with no knowledge of rocketry, none, not even theoretically, carve something that passes as a rocket schematic to modern aeronautical eyes? At what point does symbolic coincidence require its own explanation? That question doesn't have an easy answer, and that's precisely why it won't go away. Let's stay underground for a moment. Because the third carving takes us to Egypt, and it comes with a forensic detail that the official story has never adequately addressed. Beneath the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, Egypt, there is a crypt. It is narrow, low-ceilinged, and hot. Access was restricted. According to temple records, only high priests entered this space. On the walls of that crypt, there are a series of stone reliefs. They show an elongated, rounded shape like an oversized bulb. Inside the bulb, a wavy, snake-like form. At one end, what looks like a lotus flower socket, connected at the base by a cable-like structure to a rectangular box. And nearby, a human figure appearing to support or hold the device upward. Austrian researchers Peter Krasse and Reinhard Habeck spent years analyzing these reliefs and published their findings, identifying structural similarities between the carved objects and early electrical lighting devices, specifically a configuration resembling a Crookes tube, a forerunner to the modern light bulb, in which an electrical discharge causes a gas-filled glass tube to glow. Mainstream Egyptologists say it's a creation myth, the lotus flower giving birth to the sun god. The bulb is a womb, the snake is a deity. The box is a symbolic offering stand. Both interpretations are looking at the same carving. Here's what neither side disputes. The tombs and crypts of ancient Egypt are filled with extraordinarily detailed painted artwork paintings that required sustained light to produce. These painted chambers are deep underground, in rooms sealed for thousands of years. Mainstream archaeology says the Egyptians used torches and oil lamps. But archaeologists have noted something strange. In many of these chambers, including areas near Dendera, there is no soot, no smoke residue, no lamp black deposits on the ceilings or upper walls. Torches produce soot. Oil lamps produce soot. Every open flame light source in human history produces soot. The ceilings are clean. That is not an opinion. That is a physical observation that the mainstream explanation does not resolve. Did the ancient Egyptians have electric light? The honest answer is, we don't know. What we know is that the explanation we've been given leaves a ceiling without soot. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. The Baghdad Battery is not a carving, but it sits in a museum in Iraq, and it matters here. Dating to roughly 250 BC, it consists of a clay jar, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod. When filled with an acidic liquid vinegar, wine, lemon juice, it generates approximately 1.1 volts of electricity. It was discovered in 1938 by German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig, who immediately noted its resemblance to a galvanic cell. The mainstream position is that it was used for electroplating coating small metal objects with a thin layer of gold or silver. This is actually accepted as plausible by many researchers, and electroplated artifacts from the same period and region have been found that conventional chemistry cannot easily explain. But here's what that means. If the Baghdad Battery was used for electroplating, that is electricity. Controlled, directed, intentional electricity. 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta is credited with inventing the battery in 1800. The Dendera crypt is in Egypt. The Baghdad Battery is from the same broad era of the ancient Near East. The Dendera relief shows something that looks like a Crookes tube. A Crookes tube requires electricity. None of this proves anything in isolation. But these things are not isolated. We're not at the core yet. Let's move to India. And let's talk about something that most Western documentaries skip entirely because it's harder to dismiss as coincident. The ancient Sanskrit epics, texts that scholars date to compositions between roughly 400 BC and 400 AD, with oral traditions potentially much older, contain repeated, detailed references to flying machines called vimanas. Not once, not as poetic metaphor. Hundreds of references. Across multiple independent texts, these descriptions include vimanas that fly within the atmosphere, vimanas that travel underwater, vimanas used in warfare, dropping weapons from altitude, descriptions of pilots, descriptions of fuel, descriptions of the sounds these machines make. One text, the Vaimanika Shastra, attributed to the sage Bharadwaja, contains what reads as a technical manual with sections describing different types of aircraft, their materials, their operation, and the qualifications required to pilot them. The text describes components that translate roughly as graphite rods, copper coils, crystal indicators, vibrating spheres. Mainstream scholars say this is mythology, symbolic language for cosmic travel of the gods. But here's the part worth sitting with. Mythology across virtually every human culture involves gods who walk, ride animals, and travel by boat. The specific, repeated, technically framed description of mechanical flight with fuel, with pilots, with warfare applications is unusual. Mythology doesn't typically describe maintenance procedures. Does this prove ancient aviation? No. But when the written record of one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated civilizations spends enormous energy describing flying machines in engineering terms and we dismiss it entirely, we should at least ask what we're so afraid of finding. The fifth carving is on a ceiling, and it's 3,000 years old. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos in Egypt, one of the most intact ancient Egyptian temples in existence, has ceiling beams in the inner sanctum. Carved into those beams, among the standard hieroglyphic dedications, are a series of images that have been photographed and analyzed by researchers around the world. The images appear to show a helicopter, a submarine, what looks like a modern fixed-wing aircraft, and what some researchers have described as a flying saucer profile. The official Egyptological explanation is called Palimpsest, the idea that original carvings were plastered over and recarved in a later period, and that erosion or decay caused the two layers of inscription to visually merge, creating accidental shapes that look like machines. That explanation is technically possible. Egyptologists have documented palimpsest effects at other sites, but the Abydos carvings are peculiar because the shapes that emerge from the merged text are not random. They are not vague blobs. The helicopter shape, in particular, has a rotor disc, a tail rotor, a cockpit canopy profile, and landing skids in proportion. The submarine profile has a sail and hull curvature consistent with a pressurized vessel. If this is accidental, if two layers of eroded hieroglyphic text randomly produced aeronautically coherent machine profiles, then we are looking at one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of human record keeping. And if it's not accidental, then someone, 3,000 years ago, knew what these things looked like. The sixth and final carving brings us back to stone, and it brings us to a question that, once you hear it clearly, does not let go. In the valley of Chirama, in the Chhattisgarh region of India, rock paintings were discovered that Indian archaeologist J.R. Baghdad described as depicting strange beings, humanoid figures wearing what appear to be spacesuits or helmets, with no facial features, associated with disc-shaped aerial objects. These are not isolated. There are multiple panels. Some figures have antennae-like protrusions. The associated craft have dome shapes consistent with the disc and dome UFO profile that became a cultural fixture only after the 1940s in the West. The age of the paintings is estimated at between 10,000 and 5,000 years old. 10,000 years ago, no one in mainstream history was building machines. No one was flying. The Iron Age hadn't begun. The Bronze Age hadn't begun. So why are there figures in sealed suits associated with aerial craft painted on rock walls by people who, according to the textbook, had no concept of either? J.R. Baghdad himself publicly called for further investigation, saying the images were unlike any other rock art in the region and required expert analysis. That analysis, to date, remains incomplete. Now, lay the data points side by side. 1. Colombian gold figurines dated between 300 and 1000 AD, with delta wings, a stabilizing tail fin, and a fuselage geometry that passed a 1,994 aerodynamic flight test conducted by qualified engineers. 2. The sarcophagus lid of a Mayan king, carved in 683 AD, showing a reclined human figure in a posture that aerospace engineers looking at it cold describe in the same terms as a rocket cockpit. 3. Underground crypt reliefs in Egypt showing a bulb-shaped device with a filament-like interior connected to a power source in chambers where no torch or oil lamp should have burned without leaving soot, and the soot is not there. 4. The Baghdad Battery, a 2,250-year-old functional electrical device sitting in a museum in Baghdad generating measurable voltage. 5. Ceiling carvings at Abydos showing aeronautically coherent machine profiles that official archaeology attributes to an accidental overlap of eroded hieroglyphic layers. 6. Rock paintings in central India, estimated at up to 10,000 years old, showing suited figures and aerial discs described by the archaeologist who found them as unlike anything in the regional record. 6 separate cultures, 6 separate continents or regions, 6 separate time periods, all pointing at the same thing. Here is the inversion that reorders everything you just heard. We've been taught to think about ancient history as a slow, linear climb from ignorance to knowledge, primitive to sophisticated, stone tools to microchips, the arrow always pointing forward. That framework is so embedded we don't even notice it anymore. But what if that arrow is wrong? What if there were peaks before this peak? What if some of what we call mythology is engineering memory, the last surviving echo of a civilization that understood things we are only now relearning? What if the reason these carvings look like our machines is not because ancient people predicted the future, but because they were remembering the past? That is not a theory, it is a question. And it is a question the official version cannot answer with a straight face. The mainstream response to every single one of these cases follows the same pattern. Zoomorphic, symbolic, coincidence, palimpsest, mythology. Every individual case gets its own explanation. What never gets explained is why all the individual cases point in the same direction. That is not archaeology. That is damage control. Here's what the data actually says. Across at least 3 independent ancient civilizations, Maya, Quimbaya, Egyptian, there exist physical artifacts or inscribed images that modern engineers and aeronautical researchers have looked at and described, unprompted, using the language of machines. Not magic, not gods. Machines. Specific, functional, testable machines. That is not a fringe position, that is the result of applying engineering analysis to archaeological evidence. What you do with that is up to you. But the question at the center of all this, the one that keeps serious researchers up at night, is not, did ancient people have spaceships? The real question is simpler and harder than that. How much of what we think we know about human history is based on what we've found? And how much is based on what we've decided we're allowed to find? Because here's the thing about the official timeline. It didn't emerge from pure evidence. It emerged from a set of assumptions built in the 18th and 19th centuries, by institutions with very specific ideas about which civilizations were capable of sophistication and which were not. A lot of what got left on the cutting room floor was left there not because the evidence was weak, but because it didn't fit. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how institutions work. They protect the framework, even when the data breaks through the walls. The data is breaking through the walls. What you've heard today is not the full picture. It's 6 data points from what is actually a much longer list: carvings, artifacts, texts, and measurements that the mainstream archaeology establishment has no coherent explanation for. We've barely touched the surface of the physical anomalies at the sites where some of these objects were found. The precision, the scale, the material science that shouldn't exist, that's exactly where this channel goes next. Because what's above the ground at these sites is only half the story. What's beneath them and what the deep scan technology is now beginning to reveal changes the question entirely. If you've been watching this and thinking I always suspected something wasn't adding up, you were right. The numbers have always been there. Someone just kept changing the subject. Come back for the next one. The ground underneath these sites has been hiding something for a very long time, and the machines being used to look inside it are giving answers that nobody in an official position is rushing to talk about.